Good evening, good day, and welcome back. Welcome back to the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the Workplace Certificate. This is Module 3. And let me tell you, for all the 130,000 of you, we're just so happy and thrilled to see you again. Also, we are extremely honored and excited to see that this certificate is generating amazing conversations and many companies and groups are reaching out to us. They are organizing watch parties, discussion, formal, informal, and there are so many of these informal groups in social media discussing the this certificate, the topics, and also following up with this great being comfortable with the uncomfortable. We cannot be happier, but please understand also that we cannot moderate each one of these discussions or groups, and also we cannot be held responsible for what is being said there. So we appreciate your understanding there. Also, as a follow-up on my discussions last week, we already have, as you remember, we already have the auto caption with LinkedIn. And as we promised you, I'm so happy to report to all of you that starting this week, we will have live caption on YouTube. This is just delighted to be able to do that. And also complete transcript of session 1 and session 2 are now available on the certificate website. You can go there and follow it anytime. Now, let's move on to Module 3. I know you cannot wait. After the just incredible Module 2, you're asking yourself, how can it be better? I think this one is getting even better every week. And remember, the overall objective of our certificate is to help you throughout journey of DEI in the workplace. The purpose of this week, Module 3, who will be facilitated by the wonderful Terry Daniels, and she will talk to us about understanding your organizations. Terry will be providing us with tools, know-how to analyze the current organizational progress in terms of DEI, but also how to be aware of customers and vendors' expectations and different policy for DEI so that we can, starting next week, move on that journey. So it is just a great session today. And also, before we start the instructional sections, we have 2 segments. So the first one, I'm just so happy to be welcoming one of our best academic leaders, great friend of mine, Dean Eric Eisenberg, the Dean of the USF College of Art and Science, with 3 of his incredible colleagues who will continue our discussions about microaggressions and will provide us with insights on how to deal with these microaggressions. I think you're going to really enjoy that first segment. The second segment also is really exciting. I don't think you will see this topic addressed in many different platforms. We can address it because we have one of the best worldwide, most influential scholars in this area, my colleague and good friend, Dr. Balaji Padmanabhan, who is an expert in this area. He will really help us understand, can artificial intelligence be racist? And he will talk to 2 amazing scholars in this area to help us detect some of these biases embedded in artificial intelligence and different modules, but also, again, provide us with insights on how to deal with these biases embedded in artificial intelligence. As you can see, we have an amazing session for you today. I hope you will enjoy it, and I cannot wait to see you next week. Thanks again, and please enjoy. My good friend Eric, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for that kind introduction. Welcome to the next installment of our certificate program on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. My name is Eric Eisenberg, and I'm both Professor of Communication and Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Florida. I feel so privileged to speak with you today and want to start by congratulating each one of you in attendance today for seeing the importance of this topic and for actually taking the time to learn more about how a deeper focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion in your organization can positively affect both your workplace culture and your business results. As you're discovering, each installment of this certificate program focuses on a different aspect of why diversity and inclusion matters in organizations and how you can best improve. I understand that last week you had a terrific session focusing specifically on racial and ethnic diversity. The specific purpose of today's panel is to share with you some key insights from the latest research on diversity, equity, and inclusion at work to provide you with emerging best practices that you can try in your own organization. Toward this end, I have invited three of the most talented people I know to share their practical wisdom on this topic. You can read more about them in their bios, but very briefly, please meet Dr. Patrice Busnell, who is professor and chair of the Department of Communication at USF, Dr. Diane Price Herndl, who is professor and chair of the Department of Women's and Gender Studies at USF, and Dr. Michael DeYoung, professor and chair of the Department of Religious Studies at the University of South Florida. You're going to hear a lot from them in just a couple of minutes. But let me give you a little bit of framing now. Our plan here is to have a deep, honest, and frank conversation about what the research says are the best ways to approach diversity and inclusion in your organization. So let me set the stage with a few high-level findings from research in communication and psychology. Research has shown that while it seems that we all live in the same world, our perception of that world, our worldview, our perceptual set, there's lots of different names for this thing, varies depending on many, many life factors, such as where we're born, our position in the world, our finances, our race, our religion, our gender, our bodies, our life experiences. All of these shape our worldview or how we see the world. Human perception is wildly selective, and people with differing backgrounds and experiences literally notice and focus on and attend to different worlds. It's not just that they interpret the world differently, they see the world differently. If you have a friend, I've been watching, basketball and March Madness, and you see people who are 7 feet tall, 7.5 feet tall. If you meet someone who's very tall, they're always on the lookout for whether they're going to bump their heads. But depending on what your background is, how you look, your ethnicity, your religion, your body type, your profession, all produces different worldviews. And also the messages we receive when we're very young about who we are and how we should see others can have a big impact on our worldviews. Now, you all know this from your workplaces. In the world of work, athletic trainers and physical therapists notice people's fitness, hairstylists notice people's hair, realtors notice qualities of neighborhoods that other people don't notice. In your organizations, the sales and marketing people are a different breed from the engineers. The physicians and nurses are different from the hospital administrators and the lawyers. And again, it's not that they interpret things differently, it's that they actually see a different world. They have a different worldview. So now, what happens when people with different worldviews, different experiences, drawn from their own lives, interact with each other and come into contact with each other? What happens then? So problems arise in communication only when people confuse their worldview, drawn from their life experience, with the true, right, and only worldview. Psychologically, it can be so easy to think that what you see is right and what others see is either crazy or unreasonable. And all you have to do is look at politics in America right now and the polarization we're experiencing. It's so difficult for people to see the world from another person's perspective. But if a leader thinks that they see the true world and everyone in their organization is crazy or doesn't get it, two things happen. First, other people feel alienated, excluded, and not heard. And second, the leader is robbed of the opportunity to learn from others' diverse experiences, what I call learning by expanding your worldview or your perspective. So what's a better way? A better way involves establishing an inclusive culture, an inclusive dialogue across differences in worldview. So how do you do that? The way you do it is when someone you work with says something that doesn't fit with your perceptions, ask yourself if you're reacting with judgment or with curiosity. Acting with judgment is, why would you think that? That's crazy. I can't believe you have that idea. Acting with curiosity is, wow, I would have never thought of that. Tell me more about that. Why do you think that? Research clearly shows that if you see differing worldviews in an organization as a source of information and strength, you will have more effective teams, more effective solutions, and a more inclusive and happy and satisfied culture. So at work, we must begin with the idea that everyone has a somewhat different worldview. That's what diversity is. And if we can approach these differences with appreciation and curiosity, not judgment or denial, we will create inclusive, better workplaces and make better decisions. So that's the big idea from my perspective. But let's get my colleagues' take on this important topic. Patrice, Dr. Busnell, I'd like to bring you in here. I know you've done some work on cultures of inclusivity at work. Can you talk a little bit about what that's all about?
Thank you, Eric. And thank you for just a great lead into what we're going to be talking about today in terms of your take on leadership and perceptions, worldviews, and curiosity. Just a lot of complex ideas in a short period of time. So some of my work has been with colleagues at Purdue University through a provost all-institutional, over $1 million diversity and inclusion initiative, and through an NSF grant for the College of Engineering on professional formation of engineers and inclusivity. So both of these funded activities have been happening for the last few years and have started to show some really positive results by focusing in on microaggressions and focusing in on human-centered design to create change.
So microaggressions is a word that we've been hearing the last few years in the world of diversity and inclusion. I think people are really often unsure about what that means. Can you tell me, what is a microaggression? Why is it something that leaders have to care about?
Right. On the surface, it sounds like something that's relatively minor. And you're right, Eric, there is confusion about what a microaggression is. But we've been using the work of Daryl Sue and others who are defining it as everyday slights, insults, put-downs, invalidations, and offensive behaviors that arise interpersonally in everyday conversations, regular interactions. And often the people who engage in these microaggressions and speak and interact in ways that other people find invalidating often don't realize that they are doing something that's offensive or demeaning to others. And it's important because what they're doing is demeaning or offensive or a slight to others as members of particular kinds of groups.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, you can have microaggressions that are oriented racially or ethnically. They can be gendered, directed toward people with disabilities, people who are immigrants, who self-identify as LGBTQ+, and so on. There's a variety of differences in which microaggressions could possibly happen during interactions. So for example, asking someone who looks Asian where they are from, or remarking that they speak English well can be demeaning. Now, you may think that you're being curious, where are you from? Or you intend to be complimentary. Wow, your English is so good. But the assumption is that they don't belong here, that they weren't originally from the United States, and the comments immediately set them apart from other people in the workplace.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think we see from the census data that more and more people are describing themselves as biracial or multiracial. And something I've heard over the years from some of my friends and colleagues is that it's pretty insulting when people come up to you all the time and say, what are you? What really are you? This kind of thing, and not showing a lot of sensitivity to the fact that you shouldn't have to be fielding those questions all the time.
Right.
Are there some other things other than microaggressions? One of the things that I know has already come up in this certificate program is the idea of pronoun use. I think, again, to people my age and older, the idea that we're going to move away from what are traditional pronouns in the United States is confusing. So can you give a shot at explaining why pronoun use is important? And maybe, Diane, you want to jump in here too if you have thoughts about it. But Patrice, What do you think?
That would be great if Diane would jump in too. So I can bring a specific example in terms of our workplace, that we certainly are grappling with pronoun use as we want to affirm, particularly our younger departmental members. And I don't want to make an assumption that's always a generational difference, although, you know, Eric, you're right that it is difficult for some people who've grown up in a particular way to actually change and think about their pronoun use differently. But in our workplace, so the younger members are figuring out who they are and who they want their gendered identities and sexual orientations to be, and they want them to be recognized and affirmed. And so it's not that they're not willing to correct pronoun use. They may have moved from she to he, or maybe from she to they, and now have settled on he. But they're very frustrated when particular people will repeatedly misuse their pronouns. And so it's not something like, I've heard people say, oh, it's something that, not in my workplace, but, oh, it's something that's cute, right? Or, and admittedly, it takes some getting used to, especially if you've known somebody previously with one pronoun and then they shift to another. But in this case, working to affirm the identities, recognizing, you know, when you've been corrected, or maybe working towards self-correcting yourself and practicing that will just go a long way to creating a more inclusive workplace environment and keeping it up, and, you know, not lagging behind in terms of not using the pronouns somebody else would want to affirm their identities. Diane, did you want to throw something in?
So I'll throw in a couple of things. One is that some research has shown that, especially for young people, that people who do not identify as either male or female are at very, very high risk of suicide or suicide attempts, because it's a very difficult way to get around in the world. And studies have shown that if people make an effort to use the pronouns that they recognize, that those folks actually, the suicide attempt rate drops by 40%. So this is really profound. And one way that I think about microaggressions, especially as they're related to something about gender affirming pronoun use, is I think of the death of 1,000 cuts. It's like that one little insult is not the thing that's going to trigger somebody. It is the fact that they're getting little things all day, every day, and eventually just get worn down by it. And that happens with people in terms of their pronouns. That it's not just that you do it, or that the guy in the store says something ugly to them about their clothing choices. Like, why are you wearing that skirt? Why don't you wear your hair shorter, whatever? It is that's happened to them all day, day in and day out. And you feel like you're not doing anything bad, and you're really not doing anything all that bad. It's just that when it piles up, it becomes a terrible burden for people.
Absolutely. And, you know, you stumbled across a word that I think, especially outside of academia, people are just getting used to, this idea of triggers and trigger warnings and things like that. And obviously there's a whole big cultural debate about that. I wonder if either you, Diane, or actually any of you could sort of talk about the logic behind what it means to be triggered, and why this isn't just a matter of people being overly sensitive, because I think you were getting at it right there, right? Which is that it's a matter of the constancy of it, right?
And I'll pick up here, because Diane said something important that you've just remarked about, Eric, and that it is consistent. It's consistent challenges to their rights to be in places, to do particular kinds of work, to be identified as they wish to be identified. And we see this very prominently with people of color who are being questioned constantly about why they may be in particular places, or aren't they really supposed to be somewhere else? They couldn't be an engineer, they couldn't be the manager, executive, or things like that. This
couldn't be your house, shouldn't be in this neighborhood, right?
Yes, it's the consistent challenges to their competence that is so demoralizing and so absolutely exhausting. And so some of the things that that happen are common responses when people engage in microaggressions, again, racially, gendered, pronoun use, a variety of them, is that sometimes the person who has engaged in them dismisses them and goes, oh, you know, it wasn't really anything much, or denies it, or just says, oh, you're overly sensitive or overreactive, or just really defensive. But what we can do, what we really can do is just own up to it. We all engage in microaggressions. We have done it before and we will do it again. And the thing is, we need to constantly learn about what other people would consider to be microaggressions, and then thank the person who would correct us and try not to be defensive and engage in more appropriate behaviors the next time. And so it really, you know, when you talked about curiosity, and we've been talking about affirming and inclusive workplaces, these look like little things, but they really help to build an inclusive environment and culture.
Yeah, that's beautiful, Patrice. I think, you know, really another way to think about it is what Dr. Dean Lamayam talks about, is that diversity and inclusion, it's a journey, it's a learning journey. And if your stance is that, you know what, I don't know everything about how people come to their work experience, but if somebody says something that I don't understand, I need to learn. I need to learn and understand where that's coming from, as opposed to shutting down, getting defensive, all of the things that you were just talking about. Well, if you don't mind, I'd like to pivot a little bit to a specific set of examples that Diane and I have been talking about. So probably the most common activity in most of the organizations of people who are on this certificate is meetings. And there's a lot of humorous work that's been done around meetings. People love to hate meetings. Of the 10 meetings that you have in a day, probably one of them is really valuable. The other 9 are you saying you could have sent me an email. But there's another thing about meetings, which is how the issues we're talking here about diversity, equity, inclusion, how do they show up in meetings? And Diane, I think you can talk a little bit about what are the barriers to inclusion that people face when they come together and have meetings, which they do throughout the day, throughout the week.
So, so it's interesting. There's been a lot of research on, especially on gender. The research on ethnicity and race is not as easy to come by, but the research on gender is really clear that no matter the ratio of men and women in a room, unless it is 75% or more women, the talk time in the meeting will be 75% men. Mm-hmm. And if anybody is interested in kind of tracking this in their own meetings, there's an online thing called ourmentalkingtoomuch.com that is actually a little timer that you can run on your screen while you're in the middle of a meeting, and you just click it about who's talking. And it might shock you to run these during your meetings. I've run it during several of my meetings. And the only meetings where men talk less than 75% are the meetings that are all women. So that's an interesting thing. And it becomes a kind of problem, because when men dominate the conversation, then you're not hearing all the points of view. And when you're not hearing all the points of view, there are things that are going to get unacknowledged or unconfronted that might be useful. There's also another related phenomenon which is called misattribution. And this is when a woman or a person of color in a meeting comes up with a really good idea and actually does voice the idea. And the meeting just kind of moves on after that. That suggestion doesn't really get acknowledged. And then about 5-10 minutes later, one of the guys brings up exactly the same idea as his own idea. And then suddenly it is a really good idea, and it gets legs and it gets traction. And the woman or person of color who made that suggestion is sitting there thinking, I thought I was the one who said that. This has happened. So studies show that 38% of women say that this has happened to them in meetings. And there are a lot of things that you can do about these two particular kinds of activity. Mm-hmm. So one is, if you're the facilitator of a meeting it's your job to make sure that nobody is dominating that conversation unduly. And it may take training. You may actually have to work at it. You may have to run one of those talk time things yourself so that you know, because it's easy to get caught up in and not recognize what's actually going on in the dynamics of it. The second is, if you hear somebody misattributing, you probably need to say, you know, I am pretty sure that's what Barb over there said several minutes ago. Maybe we should circle back to Barb.
Yeah.
And these are really useful things. Now, you don't have to be the one running the meeting either. In feminist and especially women of color circles, we talk about amplifying. And this is when you hear one of your colleagues make a really good suggestion, you leap in and say, what a great idea. Barb had a wonderful idea there. And that is a way of making sure that someone gets credit for their idea.
Well, thank you, Diane. And this, it just strikes me that if you're a white man, if you're part of the majority culture, it's so easy to be blind to these kind of things. And so, step one, that's why I love the idea of this timer, is to sort of get outside of yourself and kind of see what the patterns of interaction look like from a different perspective, and then that allows you to address them in a way that otherwise you might be blind to. Well, that's terrific. If you don't mind, I'd like to run this just a little bit and bring Michael into the conversation and say, okay, so we've talked a little bit about race, we've talked about microaggression, we've talked about gender and sexuality, but we know that organizations today are struggling with the diversity of religious perspectives. So how does religion fit into all this? Do you see a connection between what Patrice and Diane is saying and the work that you've read and worked on?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Eric. The first thing I want to say when we talk about religious diversity is I like to emphasize that our concern is not just with people who identify as religious, but also with people who don't. So issues of religious diversity, inclusion, and equity, to my mind, incorporate all the different ways that people relate to religion, and that can be positive, negative, or neutral. So everybody needs to be aware of this, even if you're not particularly religious. Having said that, one thing you want to know in the workplace is that religious diversity requires special attention, I think, because of the privileged position of religion in American law. So there are cases where an employee might have the legal standing or an exemption to a particular company policy on the basis of religion that they simply would not have on the basis of their age or gender or sexual identity. But what we see is that despite this legal position of privilege regarding religion, studies have shown that college students spend significant time learning about people of different races, political affiliations, and sexual orientations, but much less time learning about people of different religious groups. So this suggests that while issues of religious difference are central from a legal perspective, they might be marginal from an educational or a training perspective. So it may be necessary then to give explicit attention to religion as a potentially neglected aspect of diversity in the workplace.
That's so interesting, Michael. And I could hypothesize about why people are afraid to take it on. But what do you see as the challenges in dealing with religious diversity?
Yeah, great question. I tend to consistently see two. First is simply a lack of education. So if we aren't learning about religious diversity in educational or training settings, that means we're getting our information about religion from the media or from social media, and that information might be sensationalized or even untrue. So the first goal just has to be, we need to get some basic information and education. The tricky thing, though, is that the second problem follows quickly when we solve the first. That is, a little information can be counterproductive if we use that information in a one-size-fits-all way. So as with all issues of diversity, we need to remember we're dealing with individuals who, as you said, Eric, are shaped by the groups that they identify with, but they remain individuals, right? So we don't want to say inform ourselves about, for example, certain Muslim practices and then leave from that experience thinking, well, all Muslims do X. Because we know that there will always be people who identify strongly as Muslim who nonetheless don't do X. So that's the challenge, I think, is to inform ourselves about religion as a kind of group identity without losing sight of the individuals who participate in that group in their own individual ways, as with any kind of individual identifying with the group.
Yeah, that's such an interesting and kind of subtle point. In the world of academia, we call this essentializing. That
Absolutely,
when
yeah.
somebody's part of a group, we say that don't make the mistake of assuming all members of the group are the same. But you and I have discussed this, Michael. We remember that when hospitals got sensitive to religious differences, they started putting posters up. This is years ago now, and saying, if you have this kind of religion, here's what the person is going to want. And that may be true and it may not be true, right? So do you have any concrete suggestions for organizations on how to attend to religious differences?
Yeah, I think one relatively easy place to start thinking about this is with the calendar or the schedule. If you think about it, in the United States, we operate with a holiday schedule that is Christian, or at least it's of Christian origin and now secularized, right? There are standard breaks built into the academic and work calendars around major Christian holidays of Christmas and Easter. For those who don't identify with the culturally dominant religion of Christianity, the work calendar itself can be a source of microaggressions.
Right.
Just a subtle, constant reminder of religious marginality.
Mhm.
So I would encourage managers, say, to know at least the major holidays of various religious traditions. Inform yourself when Ramadan is, the month of fasting for Muslims. Inform yourself about major Jewish holidays. But this gets back to the point about essentializing. Remember to be alert for those individual cases that inevitably fall through the cracks. Those people who perhaps identify, say, as Jewish, but who don't see holiday celebrations as a crucial part of that identity. And especially, I would say, especially be aware of the possibility that there might be individuals who identify with little known religious traditions. So to kind of emphasize a theme that I think all of us are returning to, in general, be curious, be informed, but remember to be flexible.
Oh, that's great. And we're getting towards the end of our time, but there's something I think Patrice and Diana need you to address, which is the difference between diversity and inclusion. Inclusion having to do with the structural changes that would sort of support the life of a diverse group. Would one of you take a crack at that in terms of how do we address those things for the longer term?
Sure, I'll take and try to leave some time for Patrice. So one of the things that we have to remember is that simply diversifying the workforce, but expecting everyone to still be exactly the same as the white men that they have been working with is not genuine diversity. Diversity means actually letting people be different, letting them live their differences. And this sometimes means that you have to make structural changes to workplaces around parenting, perhaps, or around religious traditions. Or it may mean that you need to understand different ways of communicating with each other.
Patrice, anything to add?
I think Diane just did a great job and certainly brought in what Michael has been talking about as well, in terms of understanding the logics by which people live their lives and structure their worlds. And that's inclusivity. And when we start building that kind of inclusivity into our workplaces, we often find that everybody benefits. It's not just the people who happen to not fit this standard ideal worker male mold,
Absolutely.
that we've had for, decades. And so thinking about it as a way to make the workplace better for everybody is just a great way to look at inclusivity.
Well, we've come to the end of our time, and I really want to thank the three of you for these wonderful insights and recommendations. And even more so, I want to thank everyone watching today for your continued interest and engagement. To sum up, I just want to say that the research on diversity, equity, and inclusion tells us that we must always be on guard personally for the human tendency to confuse our experiences and our worldview with the correct or only right worldview. And the way to do that in your work interactions is by remaining humble, remaining open, and remaining curious about others' perspectives that are different from your own. And just to sort of draw a line on it, this is not just about making people feel good. Inclusion is not just about building cultures of engagement, but it's also about effectiveness and productivity and organizational success. I would recommend to all of you a wonderful new book by Scott Page called The Diversity Bonus, where he studied hundreds of teams and discovered that it was the diversity of teams that led them to be more productive in the end. And it wasn't just about feeling better or feeling more connected, although those things are certainly important. So I want to thank you all again. Thank you all for listening. If you want more information about any of the topics you heard about today, feel free to email me at eisenberg@usf.edu, and I will get your request to the right place. We wish you the best as you complete the other parts of the certificate program. Take care.
Hello, everyone. I'm a professor at the USF MUMA College of Business. And for the last 2 decades, I've worked professionally in the machine learning and data science areas. Now, what is machine learning? And why do we need to talk about this in the context of diversity, equity, and inclusion? The easy part first. Machine learning refers to learning from massive volumes of data. In the early days, we took the perspective that data was this ultimate pristine thing that had all the hidden truths in it that we need to discover and use for business value. And that worked great for a while. And then we realized that data is not necessarily this ultimate pristine thing. It also has embedded in it actions that we took along with in its state of the world at various points in time, and all the hidden biases that may have come along with it. This led to what I think of as machine learning 2.0 now, where we understand that algorithms are very useful and can do a lot of good things, but left alone, they can also do things that they were not trained to do, and there could be unanticipated consequences that we have to manage. These algorithms can also be put into systems that may do things which are unexpected that we should start looking for. In this segment, we'll hear from 2 amazing people whose insights will help us understand how to leverage and optimize the promises of these algorithms, while at the same time mitigating the potential harms, particularly in the context of fairness and equity, that are not just important, but in a sense, the call of our times. Thank you, and hope you enjoy these interviews. Dr. Obermeyer has a very interesting background. He is a professor at the University of California, Berkeley. He is also an attending physician, an emergency room physician who continues to practice. He has an MD from the Harvard Medical School, and most interestingly and relevant to our conversation in this program, his research is at the intersection of machine learning and AI and its impact on health, with a focus on policy as well. So thank you, Ziad, for joining me today.
Very happy to be here.
So, one of the things that I know you for is your recent work in looking at AI and machine learning in the context of health, but specifically to highlight issues of bias that can come if we are not so too careful. So can you tell us a little bit about what you found in your research?
Sure. So we, I came into this research because I really think that algorithms are going to be very positive and transformative for medicine, for decision making in hospitals. And one of the cases that we were studying, with a view to making algorithms work well, was decisions that hospital administrators, people who do public health and population health management use, which is trying to find patients who are going to get sick so that we can help them now. And so every hospital, every health system has this population of patients, and some of them are headed for deterioration. And we need to find those people today so that we can get them the resources they need to help them with their health needs, their chronic illnesses. So, this is a perfect use case for algorithms. It's something that we really want algorithms to be helping us with, to look into the future and figure out which patients are going to do poorly so we can help them now. So a lot of health systems are using algorithms to target what they call population health management resources, but you can think of these things as just extra help for people who need it. So what we studied was a particular algorithm that this piece of software is used to make decisions for about 70 million patients every year in the US. The family of algorithms that behave just like it, the industry estimates are used for 150 million people. So the majority of the US population is being fed through one of these algorithms via the health system that takes care of them. And what we found is that those algorithms were biased in the sense that they were rank ordering people, in priority for who gets extra help. And what they were doing was they were essentially letting healthier white patients cut in line in front of sicker Black patients. And by our estimates, if you look at one particularly high-risk group that was fast-tracked into these extra help programs, the overall population that we were studying was about 12% Black. That high-risk group that got preferential access to resources was 17% Black. And so you might think, great news, Black patients are overrepresented in this group. How could there be bias? When you look at the health needs of that population, though, by our estimates, it should have been about 47% Black. And so there was this enormous bias that was built in that we might have missed had we just looked at the fraction Black of that high-risk group. So it was a really large amount of bias that was affecting millions and millions of people across the country.
I mean, two very interesting things in what you said. The first is just the baseline to think of, right? So when people think of debiasing, sometimes the baselines they think of is just the population distribution.
Yeah.
But I think you raised a very important point where sometimes that's not the right baseline at all to look at. So I'll just file that away in our conversation.
Absolutely.
But the second thing I think that you brought up was also when we think about why this happens, the naive thought there is, people are engineering these things to do nasty stuff, but we know that's not the case at all. Right, that problems like this are not happening because people are consciously engineering algorithms to be bad. They're happening, in fact, because people are not thinking about, doing it the right way, and they're not aware of some of the issues that come up if you're not careful. So in your own work, I know you did a lot of thinking onto why the algorithms did what they did. So what did you find about the reasons for this happening?
Yeah, I first wanted to really reinforce your point, which is that what we found and what I'll tell you about is that this wasn't a case of people doing bad things or being biased. Mm-hmm. It was the case of a subtle technical problem with an algorithm that lots of people were introducing into the algorithm, not just the company we studied, but every other company that was making these algorithms. Not just companies, but also academic medical centers and even government agencies. So this was not a kind of bad apple story. This is a kind of technical problem in a space that we're only just learning about and learning how to address bias and diagnose it in these settings. So here's the essence of what we found is that let's look at two patients, one Black patient, one white patient, who were scored the same way by the algorithm. So they had the same risk score. They went on to have the same likelihood of getting extra help because the algorithm was used to help allocate those extra help programs. What we found was that the Black patient, on average, would go on to be sicker, to have more flare-ups of chronic conditions, to have worse blood pressure, worse diabetes, worse kidney function than the white patient. So their health needs were greater at the same algorithm score. So they were being treated the same, but the Black patients needed more help as measured by how their health turned out over that next year. Why was that? Well, the algorithm was supposed to be finding people who would go on to get sick. The subtle technical problem that I alluded to was that when we train the algorithm, we have to figure out how to measure going to get sick. So, when we're talking just one human to another, you know what I mean by going to get sick. But there's no variable in any data set that is called going to get sick or get sick. So you need to decide, okay, what is the particular variable I'm going to train this algorithm to predict? And the variable that this team chose, and as I said, lots of other companies chose, lots of government agencies and academic groups choose, is how many dollars does that person go on to cost the healthcare system? It's not an unreasonable choice because sick people do cost money to take care of. The problem is that not every sick person costs the same amount of money. So you can imagine if you or I has a heart attack, we're going to get good care, we're going to call an ambulance, we're going to head to the ER, we're going to get all of the care we need. If you're a poor patient or a Black patient, you're going to be less likely to get the care you need, both because of barriers to access, to getting into the hospital, but also because the healthcare system just treats you differently. There's a breakdown of trust in that relationship between doctor and patient that makes the doctor less likely to run diagnostic tests and get to the bottom of the problem. All of those things add up and mean that Black patients on average cost less when they have the same medical problem as a white patient. So when we train an algorithm to predict cost as a proxy for those health problems, we introduce that bias. Now, that's again, as you said earlier, this is a very understandable thing, and it's a subtle technical issue. It's, do I train on this variable or that variable? But those small technical choices can actually have huge implications for bias.
It's such an easy mistake to make because in many institutions, the people building the algorithms are often the data scientists, optimizing accuracies and so on. But then when it gets deployed, somebody else figures out how to use the algorithm. And if it gets deployed with a different objective in mind, it doesn't make sense to expect that the algorithm will optimize the objective you have in mind, right? And I like the title of your paper too, right? So you said, if you're going for A, how do you expect to achieve B, right? Or something.
That's exactly right. It's a version of something that many people are familiar with, which is like when we incentivize one thing, that is exactly what we get. So when we incentivize teachers based on test scores, we get good test scores. We don't get well-rounded, educated students necessarily, unless that's a kind of byproduct of what we're incentivizing. So just like people, algorithms are incentivized to predict exactly the thing we tell them to predict, not to predict the thing that we mean, but don't have the data to express.
So I'm sure on that note, a lot of our hospitals and insurance companies are now doing exactly this. They're using their own data. They have access to machine learning algorithms, and they're building all kinds of models, patient related and even operations related. So this will be important for them to reflect on. But I wanted to ask you more specifically, if I'm looking at this from the perspective of a hospital system or from an insurance company, what should I be doing today based on what you know?
Yeah, maybe I'll start by saying what I don't think you should be doing, which is paying a lot of attention to the things that a lot of people talk about, like, oh, do I allow the algorithm to use the race variable? Do I need to make sure that I'm, curating the inputs to the algorithm? What we found in our research is that the inputs are far less important than the output. In other words, what is the exact variable that I'm training the algorithm to predict? So that decision is really the most consequential decision that we can make when we're training an algorithm, but it's often treated as an afterthought. And so really paying much more attention to that decision about what am I telling the algorithm to do? What is the value system that I'm putting into the algorithm by training it to predict this variable? That's a really important decision. And critically, this is not a pure data science decision. This is a business strategy decision that needs to be made at very high levels of the organization in very deliberate ways. This is not something that can be pushed down to kind of some lone technical person who's building an algorithm. These are deeply consequential decisions for the business and for strategy that happen to be manifested as data science problems. So I think really putting a lot of thought into those decisions is important. And as we showed, we actually worked with the company that made that biased algorithm to begin with, and by retraining their algorithm, with their support and cooperation, to predict a set of variables that were more related to health and less related to healthcare costs, we were able to dramatically reduce the amount of bias in the algorithm, and more importantly, or just as importantly, get those extra help resources to people who need it. So what we were doing wasn't affirmative action when we fixed the algorithm. It wasn't saying, oh, we have some cutoff where we want Black patients to get more resources. No, we want the resources to get to people who need the resources. Those people just happen to be disproportionately Black, and happen to have been excluded from that earlier version of the algorithm that was trained on what we viewed as the wrong variable. So fixing these algorithms is also possible, but it all starts with that very important decision of, how do I train the algorithm? What am I incentivizing the algorithm to produce for me?
That's outstanding and very actionable. Now, on a final note, we've been talking about some of the biases behind machine learning algorithms, but obviously, you've been working in this space long enough to see that there are lots of promises and positives that can come from the use of AI and machine learning in health. How confident are you that we'll be able to squeeze out all the goodness from AI and machine learning while making sure that it doesn't go crazy on us from the perspective of equity, in particular in the healthcare context?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm basically optimistic about the role that algorithms can play in medicine. I think as a doctor myself, anyone who's practiced medicine knows how many mistakes you make when you're practicing medicine, and how much you don't know. And so, for me as a practicing physician, it's really exciting to think ahead to all of the things that algorithms can do for us. And my work on where algorithms go wrong is fundamentally motivated by that attitude, which is that, we need to fix these problems, but we're heading in basically a very exciting new direction. And so I'll just give one example, that's maybe more positive from my work, of an algorithm that can reduce bias. What we did is we trained an algorithm. The normal approach when we're, for example, teaching an algorithm to read X-rays is to teach it to read X-rays like a radiologist. But of course, part of the exciting thing about machine learning is that we might be able to do better than radiologists, not just teach the algorithm to mimic what the radiologist is saying. So instead of training the algorithm on the radiologist's opinion about the X-ray, we trained the X-ray to predict which knees, we were studying knee arthritis, which knees were patients going to report as painful. And in so doing, we actually discovered a number of new things about X-rays that radiologists don't currently look at that better explain the pain that patients were experiencing, which is not surprising. When we first developed, in medicine, our knowledge of X-rays, we were studying coal miners in Lancashire in England. So it was a very specific form of knowledge that happened to give us some general insights about human physiology. But it's no surprise that supplementing that knowledge with new populations in new time periods is going to yield additional insights. So not only did that algorithm better explain pain that modern populations in the US were experiencing, it also had this debiasing effect, where the people who benefited from that additional pain explanatory power of the algorithm relative to the radiologist were disproportionately not just Black, but also poor and less educated, because those people were different from the original populations that were used to build up our medical knowledge about arthritis. So I think algorithms can have this really powerful role in pushing forward our knowledge. That will have an equitable component, but it will also just push forward knowledge, which is also good.
Thank you. That's wonderful, and thank you so much, Dr. Ziad. We'll let you go, and we look forward to seeing your work in this area. Continue, and thank you so much for your time.
Okay, bye-bye.
It's a pleasure to talk to Dr. Nicole Turner-Lee. Nicole is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute and also director of the Center for Technology Innovation at Brookings. Dr. Turner-Lee has degrees from Colgate University and a PhD from Northwestern in sociology, and since then has done incredible work at the intersection of technology and public policy. So she's probably spent more time in it than most people have done, and incredible work on the digital divide and broadly in the last few years, work on particularly diversity and equity. and the role that algorithms and technology can play. So thank you so much, Nicole, for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
So, recently your group at the Brookings Institute put out I think a very high profile report on algorithmic bias mitigation and detection. And not just based on your own research, and you've published extensively in this area, but also based on a wonderful focus group where you brought in, I think, close to 40 leaders, which is a wonderful opportunity and a great thing to have done. And what were some examples of high-profile examples of algorithmic bias that came out?
Thank you for having me for this conversation. And I think that this is so important for us to talk about algorithmic bias. We often think when we talk about computers and machines that there's just no way that there could be bias actually placed into discrete mathematical models. But when you place those models within social context, and I'm a sociologist by training, there are socio-technical implications of that model that have to be explained. And in the case of that particular paper and focus group, which is available on Brookings' website, it's called Algorithmic Bias Detection and Mitigation. What we found is that there are a series of examples that could be perceived as innocuous, and then examples that could become much more consequential when you look at the populations that will be affected. So an innocuous example is, the type of credit card offerings that are presented to different populations. LaTanya Sweeney at Harvard suggests that Black sounding names tend to get higher interest credit card offerings, or they tend to have more predatory financial offerings when they are online. And when they click those offerings, they get more of them, right? Because the algorithm is trained to pick up on that behavior. I say it's somewhat innocuous because it doesn't necessarily mean that they apply for it, but it's something that is delivered to them in the form of an ad that reflects the external systemic inequalities that we currently experience. The more severe examples is when we start looking at the application of algorithms in criminal justice. When we begin to think about the use of algorithms to determine whether or not someone should be released or detained, and that data in which the algorithm is trained is based on collected arrest records. Now, I don't know how many people are currently watching television, but what you're experiencing, for example, the George Floyd trial, is that African Americans tend to live in communities where they experience disproportionate numbers of arrests, higher rates when compared to white suburban communities. So you can only imagine what that data is, what data is being used to train that algorithm, right? And that data, therefore, then replicates the types of inequalities that we see externally through these machine learning models. And so a lot of that is my work. And I could go on and on, from employment algorithms that are trained on male data and kick out women's names in colleges, to facial recognition technologies that misidentify people because it cannot pick up on the complexion of their skin if it's too dark or the lighting is not right. At the end of the day, if left unchecked, these algorithms have the potential, I think, to deepen the systemic inequalities that already exist for certain populations.
Yeah, it's just incredible work, and it's amazing that people like you with the scientific background, are working in these areas, because now you can actually come up with solutions, right? But you talked about innocuous to consequential, and in the middle you also have the everyday life examples. And some time back there was an online recruitment example where a company was processing resumes of for job applicants. And they figured out that it was selecting people in a very biased manner too. And so everyday simple things like applying for a job, being selected, these things are algorithmic in many places, but we're starting to see problems there too, right?
Yeah, we are. And it's one of those cases where I think when we begin to look in this gray area, it's really interesting, right? Because one part of it is there are discrete demographic variables about populations that we know of. But unfortunately, the internet doesn't tell you specifically that I'm a Black woman, for example, that's a certain height or weight or wears glasses. What you find out is that I may be a person who has an affinity towards, other members that look like me on Facebook, or I may read certain journals that might suggest my race, or my zip code may act as a proxy for the type of community in which I live. And so I think we have to be careful, because combined, these types of variables actually generate the type of hidden bias, because at the end of the day, the internet is so opaque. And it's this causality of relationships that actually exist that I think, which is your question, why would a sociologist care about this? But we care about this because we care about systems, we care about structures, and we care about how systems and structures interact with people. And at the end of the day, if you are a machine learning scientist, or you're an engineer or a computer scientist in general, you may not understand that these things actually exist. And I think that's where, when we start seeing these algorithms applied to everyday decision making, we have to step back and say, do we need a human in the loop? Or maybe we say, do we need a sociologist in the loop who can actually make sure that we're not having this model create more bias?
And I think you brought up an incredibly amazing point, which is, when computer scientists and machine learning folks look at data, you tend to look at this data as this objective thing that you want to learn from and build models. But when you bring in the human perspective, the data is not an objective thing. The data is a combination of things that happen and things that we do that show up in the data. And if you're not conscious that the data reflects the actions of people, then you run the risk of learning from the actions of people in ways that you may not want to learn. And I think that kind of sort of takes us in a different direction, which is, I think, when you look at the reasons for why these types of biases, algorithmic biases exist, there are many, right? And in your focus group, I think one part of what you did was just talked about why, right? It's usually not that people don't start off saying, I want to be biased. I want to build an algorithm that's biased. It never happens that way. But somehow the result turns out to be biased. And what are some, maybe one or two reasons that you think that these algorithms tend to be this way? If not, if we are not careful.
Well, I think it goes back to a couple of things. I think first and foremost, we have to think about whether or not everything that we do should be automated, right? There are going to be instances where we think that we should automate a particular function because it may be more efficient for government to institute a child abuse hotline that allows them to screen calls. Or we may believe that we need a healthcare algorithm that allows us to find eligibility when it comes to chronic disease. But some of those things we actually may want to step back and say, and I use this analogy, is it responsible? Is it trustworthy? Is it lawful? Is it inclusive?
Mm-hmm.
And the suggestion is that there are going to be some functions that you may want to sit back and say, this really requires greater scrutiny before we actually automate this. What are some of the assumptions, the norms, the values of the developers? What are the values and normative functions that actually exist in the world? And what outcomes, sort of whiteboard out what outcomes may actually happen that may have you thinking about whether or not this is something that you want to apply a model to. When that's the case, I always tell people it's important for you to also then understand what data are you using. If the data you're using is underrepresented or overrepresented of the populations that you're trying to serve, then you need to go back and fix that data. I mean, as a researcher with a PhD, I can't just go out and interview populations without some type of IRB or human care statement. I think we need to see that in some cases, like financial services, housing, employment, where there'll be opportunities that will be foreclosed on vulnerable populations because we didn't take that time to really think about and evaluate the outcomes of the model. And then I think there are going to be decisions that should be appealed, right? There are going to be some decisions that are just not right. Unfortunately, when I use facial recognition technology and it doesn't recognize me because I change my hair often, I want to be able to share that with the designer and say, hey, this is not optimized for me as a Black woman. It's not optimized based on the lighting I'm using. It's not optimized based on what side of the bed I woke up and the way my hair looks today. And I think that type of feedback loop is not often in place. It also contributes to the type of biases as well. I'll just end here. I'm working at Brookings on something called an Energy Star rating, which basically sort of takes the same model of this better housekeeping seal. When I was working on the project that you're referencing, I had the opportunity to work with Paul Resnick out of University of Michigan and a woman by the name of Jeannie Barton who worked at the Better Business Bureau. And it was the longest paper we ever did because it was a sociologist, an engineer, and a lawyer. And if you put the three of us in the room, you don't get any compromise. But what it taught me is you have to look at algorithmic bias from like a three-legged approach. What are the best practices when it comes to technical cadence? Where are the policy prescriptions that are necessary to ensure that they're lawful and responsible and trustworthy? And how do you involve civil society and consumers to give you that type of feedback so that you can be sure that the algorithm is optimized to perform the same on a variety of different contexts And that's how we sort of define bias. When similarly situated people, places, and objects receive both differential treatment, because obviously I like blue dresses compared to someone who likes red, but we also see where people receive disparate impact, where that credit card offering becomes part of the widening wealth gap that keeps people out of the financial market, or women out of the careers in engineering. Those are the disparate impacts that we need to be careful of more so when we're looking at algorithmic bias.
Thank you. Now, obviously, the good thing now is that we know to look for these things. Many years back, we didn't know. Now we know. So if you had a magic wand and, you could make every company in the world start to do something now, what would that be?
Well, first and foremost, they should come and talk to me first. And read our paper. Make every person read that
We'll
paper.
make sure they get it.
Right. I would actually just say to every company that's thinking about this, a lot of companies are putting together fairness models and trying to put together a fairness team. But I would tell companies when they actually think of concepts like fairness, that they remember that these are elusive terms. They have trade-offs. What is fair to you is going to be fair to somebody else, which may be different to somebody else. And I think it's important for companies to remind their quantitative modelers and their engineers that when they're developing these models, that they either bring a set of unconscious biases or explicit biases. That two, that no model is going to perform the same under different contexts. And three, when you're defining fairness or you're trying to de-bias algorithms so that it can at least be democratized, that you have to remember that you're placing the model within an already flawed system. And I think if I got more companies to sort of hear that message, that yes, I am all for computers and technology. When I grew up, I used to run home and watch 3 cartoons. The Jetsons, where George Jetson was in an autonomous vehicle and riding around the space. The Flintstones, where Fred Flintstone drove a car that had rocks as wheels, and Fat Albert, because that's what every African-American kid did when they were little, run home and watch Fat Albert. But George Jetson has survived, Fred Flintstone didn't. And it's important for us to understand the consequences and the circumstances and the criteria that allows for that type of permanence when we look at these emerging technologies. Companies should want their products to perform well across the board. And that's why I'm doing this model. It's not a regulatory regime that says you didn't follow all 3 of these pillars, so as a result of that, you don't get X. But it actually allows for, I think, an environment where we actually rise to the top in terms of doing our best to optimize the performance of the algorithm by reducing the bias.
Thank you so much, Nicole. We could keep talking to you forever, and we will do a part 2, part 3, part 4, and part 5 with you, even more. So thank you so much again for the wonderful work you're doing and for sharing some of it with us. We'll make sure to share your paper with the group and look forward to talking to you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Hello, I'm Terry Daniel, and welcome to Module 3, Understanding Your Organization. So the areas that we'll focus on for our session this evening is why DE&I. We'll talk about some successful organizational strategy. We'll talk a little bit about governance, inclusive leadership, which is huge when you are implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies within your organization. We'll talk a bit about diversifying your supply chain. And finally, I'll offer some tips to consider for implementation. So let's get started. Why DE&I? So Forbes magazine says that cultivating a diverse employee population where everyone feels able to bring their best selves to work is not only the right thing to do, but it's also better for business. The Center for Talent Innovation stated that publicly traded companies with two-dimensional diversity were 70% more likely to see ideas actually become market products and 158% more likely to understand their target end users when one or more of those members of that team represented the user's demographics. Fast Company. Organizations with above average gender diversity and levels of employee engagement outperform companies with below average diversity and engagement by 46 to 58%. That is huge. Why DE&I? The American Sociological Association concludes that companies reporting the highest levels of racial diversity brought in nearly 15 times more sales revenue on average than those with the lowest levels of racial diversity. CNN Money, 56% of the 87 million millennials in our country today are white, compared to the 72% of 76 million members of the baby boomer generation. Folks, things are changing. Glassdoor, 67% of job seekers and entrepreneurs consider diversity an important factor when considering employment opportunities and doing business with organizations. And more than 50% of them want these organizations to do more to increase diversity. Why DE&I? I think we know why. Let's talk about economic impact. And I'd like to talk about women-owned business enterprises and having supplier diversity as an extension of your diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Women-owned business enterprises now comprise the fastest growing segment of the US business community and employ more than 4 million workers and contribute over $1 trillion to the economy. And if you break this statistic down even further, Black women-owned businesses are the fastest growing segment of women-owned businesses. Over the last 10 years, minority business enterprises accounted for more than 50% of the 2 million new businesses started in the United States, and they created 4.7 million jobs. There are over 2.5 million veteran-owned suppliers in the United States, generating $1.14 trillion in annual sales. And for minority suppliers, there are 4 million of them, contributing with annual sales of $700 billion. This is huge. Think about how you, as an organization, can support the growth and development of diversity across the country. The University of Washington Foster School of Business says $1 million spent with diverse-owned suppliers equals $2.1 million in economic impact. That's huge. So ultimately, focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion and having supplier diversity as an additional focus gives your organization a competitive advantage. It increases innovation, it drives employee retention and increased job satisfaction, and it promotes business growth and development of diverse-owned suppliers and small businesses as well. And ultimately, it increases your revenues. So what are some of the important strategies other organizations are implementing to drive success around their DE&I strategies? The first is collaboration. And collaboration helps us problem solve. It brings people across your organization together. And it also helps us learn from each other. And that is really what creating an inclusive organization is really all about. Additionally, they have governance around their DE&I strategies as an organization. And governance ensures that there are clear lines of communication, and there, as management establish goals and key performance indicators, it helps to be transparent, and it also helps organizations to track performance toward those key performance indicators. Additionally, a successful strategy is making sure that you have active support by senior leaders in your organizations. When you are implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies across your organization, inclusive of supplier diversity, support has to flow down from senior leadership. Also, active support by senior leaders increases levels of engagement by other team members, and it adds credibility to what the organization is implementing. I have 2 teenagers, and I know that I have used the statement sometimes, do what I say and not necessarily what I do. Let me tell you, that does not work. And it's the same thing with senior leadership. You have to be engaged. You have to be involved. And the other thing about it is you have to be authentic. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as our time goes on. Appointing an executive level champion. This is an essential strategy because you have to have a team around this to support the growth and development of your programs. And it has to be a job that's consistent every single day with that focus. And it also demonstrates as an organization your genuine commitment to diversity and to cultural change, as well as articulating the objectives of your organization. This is so important to make sure that you have clear objectives. We see a lot of organizations, and even many of those on today, that have really, really honed in and focused on your diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies. And you're seeing a lot of mission statements, and they're articulating, their stance, and that is very, very important to do. And you see kind of a general toolkit that a lot of organizations are implementing, but finally, it is very, very important. You've got to go beyond that mission statement. I just talked a little bit about authenticity, and it's important because you've got to understand this is real. The lived experiences of people of color, diversity, it's real. And in order for an organization to really be successful in this space, it's so important to go beyond that mission statement. How are you uniting your employees? What is your motivation behind implementing your DE&I strategies? And I just talked about being authentic as an organization. So these are some successful strategies that other organizations are implementing that you want to keep in mind when you're building out your program and the content around that. So we just talked about some successful strategies that organizations are implementing, and I would like to introduce Ms. Mona Garland, who is the Global Head of Inclusion and Diversity and the Vice President of Human Resources North America for Brambles. Welcome, Mona.
Well, hello. I'm so excited to be here today, Terry.
Thank you so much for joining me. I have a couple questions that I'd like to ask you. So some of the organizations that are joining us today may be for the first time focusing on their DE&I initiatives and even including supplier diversity in their strategy. This can be an overwhelming task. So where should they begin?
Well, there is no surefire way of where to begin, but I'll definitely say it's so important to start with the basics. I mean, we have to, one of the things we did was identify a great mentor in the industry. We went out and we attended industry events, but most importantly, we started out as a pilot in North America. and had conversations with the teams to learn what did they want to do, how did they want to engage. And when I think about, when you think about a pilot, there's often a start and a stop. But one thing that was really exciting about our journey is that we have the pilot, it started and it never stopped. I mean, and I attribute a lot of that to a lot of the homework that we did and really taking the time to get the buy-in at all levels of the organization. I mean, we got our stakeholders involved. We found out, not only, what things were important to our teams, but also how to motivate everyone to get engaged and to buy in. For example, we set up various different pillars as part of our I&D council. And one of those pillars is strategic benchmarking, which, the business wants to know about the bottom line. And so that's one thing that we were very intent upon doing, and making sure that we had data and numbers and ways to measure any progress that we were making in the business. So I think, oftentimes when people think of setting up an I&D council program initiative within the business, the first thing that people think about are ERGs, employee resource groups, affinity groups. And in a lot of ways, that's, the natural tendency is to do that, but oftentimes that's putting the cart before the horse. It's really important to establish the foundation, do all those things I just talked about with the buy-in, kind of know directionally where you want to go. And make sure that as you do get to the point of embarking on ERGs or affinity groups, that it's established in a way that it's inclusive versus exclusive. Because when you hear, the women's group, right? You hear the African, Black, and Caribbean group, you're like, can I join that? It's all about how you launch it. It's all about who you identify as the lead for those very different ERGs. For example, we have a white male who leads our women's ERG. And we just so happen to have a white person who leads the African American, Black, and Caribbean ERG. And so I think, that is a very obvious way of saying, hey, we're about being inclusive. This is about learning, growing, and really sharing information. And so those are some of the things to think about as you embark on that journey. And it's such a fun journey because you get to learn so much about so many different things.
Yes, it sounds like you all are doing an amazing job. And one of the key things that you said was making sure that you had buy-in from your senior leadership and making everyone feel included in what the organization is doing to support the growth and development of your DEI strategy across the board. So how do organizations identify barriers or issues that employees may be experiencing in the area of DE&I, and what kinds of barrier interrupters can be implemented to drive a more inclusive environment?
Well, it's interesting. One of the things that we found is we have systems in place already. And one of those things is the employee engagement survey. I mean, that is a wealth of data and information. And we actually, as part of one of our benchmarks, is associated with outputs from the employee engagement survey in terms of the impact that our efforts are having on the culture and the business. And so, using the data that you have available and also being specific to the needs of a particular region. As Terry, as you shared, I'm the head of inclusion and diversity globally. So not every region is the same. There are some regions around the world where it's not okay to talk about race. And for me, even leading this effort for the business, it was very informative and educational for me. So I think it's really important to listen to the people in the region, really try to understand, across the board, what are some of the areas of opportunity and things that you want to address, because it won't be the same for all places.
Exactly. And so you mentioned a little bit earlier when we first started our conversation, the support of executive leadership and having executive level champions in the organization. And that is extremely important because we know that for the success of these programs to be substantial, it has to start from the top and flow through all layers of the organization. So how does governance and active support by senior leaders articulate into the overall success of an organization's DE&I strategy?
Well, I will say, out of the gate, it's a non-negotiable. For example, when the team and I thought about embarking on the, I went to the top. I went to the president and shared why it was important to the business, shared that compelling message, and, really drove home how it could impact our innovation efforts and everything that we're doing as a business. And getting that type of executive champion, of which she served as the executive champion for North America, that was a game changer. I mean, she's well respected in the business. And so by having her side by side with me, and not just, this African American woman being the only one talking about inclusion and diversity and trying to get it over the line, it made a huge difference. I think, it's not just at the very beginning. It's not just at the more broad strategic level. It's also when you're setting up your ERGs, for example. You want an executive sponsor attached to each one of those. You want an executive sponsor attached to each one of your initiatives, each one of your pillars, because that shows unity and it's an obvious show of buy-in, and it definitely gives you the flexibility and the autonomy to really drive the initiatives on your teams and look toward the ultimate outcome, which is creating an authentic environment where everyone feels included, where it's your mind just opens up when you can be your authentic self. So,
Awesome. When you can be your authentic self. I love that. Mona, thank you so much for joining me today. I am so excited that you were able to come on and that we were able to glean from your wisdom. And so thank you so much for what you're doing to support diversity, equity, and inclusion across the world, and for all of our participants tonight. Thank you.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
So Mona was amazing. And now let's talk a little bit more about that governance that she spoke about. She talked about strategic benchmarking and some other practices and procedures that they have implemented to make sure that that governance is there. So what is governance? Governance is a system of rules, practices, and processes by which an organization is directed and controlled. Governance ensures effective management of the interests of the organization's internal and external stakeholders. And when driving diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, it also focuses on the organization's clients, your supply chain, your investors, government relations, and the local community. So when we talk about board-driven organizations, and I'm going to also go in and say organizations of, and especially higher learning, institutions of higher learning, what are some of the things that you should be asking internally within your organization to support this growth and development of diversity? And let me preface this conversation by saying, I know that there are a lot of organizations who are really just starting to focus on this initiative. There are organizations who have not even implemented maybe a formal supplier diversity program. But some of these key areas that I'm going to talk about can be very, very difficult to hear candid feedback. But let me say this, unless you hear the candid feedback, and you really take that into consideration when you're building out your organizational strategy, there will not be change or will not be success. So what are some of the questions and some of the things that your organization should be asking? The first, what is the organization's inclusion brand externally, such as what diverse stakeholders and clients are saying about their experience with the organization's culture, products, and services? It's important. It may be difficult to hear it, but it's so important as you drive change. Next, how do the board, management, and other members and leaders across your organization speak about diversity and inclusion, both internally and externally? What are they saying outside of your organization? That is so very important, because you want to make sure that your mission and your goals are represented outside of your organization and inside of your organization. So it's really important to make sure that you have board members and leaders across your organization who are exemplifying the real mission and goal of your organization. Next, what could the organization's alliances, clients, and vendors convey about its stance on diversity, equity, and inclusion? This is key. You know, at the University of South Florida, we have a very strong supplier diversity initiative. So what are your suppliers talking about when they come to the table? When you are instilling and instituting programs and processes and bid procedures, even in your procurement processes, your hiring procedures, do they understand your organization's stance on diversity, equity, and inclusion? Do they know, as a contracted partner with your organization, that you have an expectation for them to come alongside you and help to drive diversity, equity, and inclusion at a higher level as a partner to your organization? Additionally, and the one that I have in the center, this is so key to the success of an organization around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is understanding that employee perception is a critical business driver, and challenge management to implement ongoing measures to effectively assess employee perception of inclusion at the organization. And you've got to do this in a way in which your employees and your leaders and your team members across your organization feel like they can share that candid feedback with you about their personal experiences without the fear of being fired or retaliated against. And so this is so important, to create that space for people to be able to bring them, their best selves to work and really communicate about things that they feel could be implemented to make your workplace a more inclusive environment. Actively embody inclusive leadership behaviors and traits in all personal and professional interactions. We'll talk a little bit more about inclusive leadership as we move forward in our presentation this evening, but having inclusive leaders is essential to having a successful diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative across your organization. Because if your leaders are not inclusive, it creates a situation where employees and other team members are not necessarily honest about their feedback. So that is so key to having a successful program as well. Understand how key stakeholders within the organization's approach, manage, and promote inclusion, and consider how that aligns with and may impact the business's bottom line. That is huge. And when I think about this one, I think about recruitment and retention strategy. And in a upcoming module, you will hear a lot more in-depth information about building retention and recruitment strategies. But you've got to understand what kinds of things that you have in place. Are you promoting? Who are you promoting? Are you promoting people of color? Are you infusing diverse suppliers in your supply chain? Are you, what's your focus? And so that is really key to the success of a program as well. And then finally, helping management strengthen the organization's external inclusion brand and advising management on associated risks for areas of improvement. So what is inclusive leadership? I mentioned that a few times in the previous slide. Inclusive leadership is a critical capability to leverage diverse thinking in a workforce with increasingly diverse markets, customers, and talent. And being an inclusive leader means challenging, but ultimately empowering. So now I would like to welcome Dr. Allison Kroon, who is the Associate Vice President of Student Success and the Dean of Undergraduate Studies. Welcome, Allison.
Thanks, Terry.
Thank you for joining me in this very, very important conversation.
Absolutely.
So I just spoke briefly about inclusive leadership, and one of the keys to being an inclusive leader is demonstrating a commitment to support diverse colleagues now and moving forward. And so as you've transitioned into new roles, can you share an example of something a leader has done to demonstrate their commitment and support?
Absolutely. You know, it really starts before the staff member even joins the team. And the example I would share is in the very beginning, when you're thinking about the position and how it's being created and who's involved in the interview process and what that's going to look like on that recruitment, and making sure that everyone is involved and has voice in thinking about the organization and how this person can be an asset before they've even been interviewed. And then throughout the process, making sure that people are involved at every stage, at every level of the organization, depending on the position. And then ensuring the success of that person once they are in the seat. And that means making sure the resources are there for them. Sometimes we do a great job of the recruitment, but the resources aren't there once the person arrives. And the examples I'll share is intentionally planning for meetings and opportunities for that person to connect with colleagues and getting them engaged immediately. Specifically a mentorship program where you can connect with people outside of your immediate department, across the organization, or even in organizations that are within your community. So even outside of your organization, but maybe physically located close by, that you can connect with them and have that humanizing, authentic relationship that was mentioned earlier is so important, because we often see people in their position rather than the person that they are. So giving them the opportunity to be seen in that way, to be vulnerable, and help them get engaged immediately is really important for their success and ultimately the success of the organization.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So I know that obviously you are a person in a position of leadership. You know, can you offer maybe a few other strategies that you can offer to assist in creating a more inclusive work environment for everyone?
Absolutely. And you shared several, and the panelists and the speaker earlier, I would echo all of those, certainly being curious and being humble. I would add to those to be prepared. Certainly, I feel a responsibility in my role, especially as a white woman, to be an advocate and an ally, and to be prepared for what I hear from the team and make sure that I'm listening at all times. And so if I do hear those concerns, that I have actions and processes in place for recourse or demonstrated policies that I'm supporting, and making sure that it isn't something that I hear and then it just continues to be, okay, let's get together again and let me hear this through a different venue, but I actually have prepared action steps. And the same goes in place for an organization that needs to be ready for response and being proactive with constant communication and support to their team. It won't feel like it's out of the blue. And that's a strategy that's been really important in my experience, and in a successful way for the team to feel supported regardless of the situation.
Absolutely. And it really gives employees a sense of being included, having that safe space where they feel like they can share honest feedback with you as a leader. And so I just think that that is so important. And, you know, when you're looking at, you know, building out these strategies, I mean, it's essential to have these kinds of things in place. So Allison, thank you so very much for your insight. Thank you so much for joining me today, and you have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you. Bye-bye. So we'll go ahead and continue with our presentation this evening. And we talked and we heard Allison talk about some of the traits of inclusive leaders. So I wanted to really kind of go more in depth about those. And so the first one is they show a visible commitment to their team, and they articulate authentic commitment to diversity. They challenge the status quo. I think we heard Allison talk about that. They hold others accountable and make diversity and inclusion a personal priority. They walk in humility, and they're modest about their capabilities. They admit their mistakes, and they create a space for others to contribute. We just heard that. That is so important, to offer a safe space for employees to feel heard. They're aware of bias, and they show awareness of personal blind spots as well as flaws in the system, and they work hard to ensure meritocracy. They're curious, and they demonstrate an open mindset. They're deeply curious about others, about their lived experiences, and they show empathy, which is huge. Additionally, they are culturally intelligent and very attentive to others' cultures, and they adapt as required. You know, in some of the earlier content, we talked about, you know, making sure that we're sensitive to religion. And, you know, we heard in even one of the other modules that that is such an important concept, because, you know, you want to make sure that you are creating a space for people to practice what they need to, and to make sure that they are free to bring their best selves to work, and not have to fear any kind of, you know, anything happening to them, because they are who they are. And lastly, they're effective collaborators. We talked about collaboration a little bit earlier, and how important it is, because it brings people together, it brings people closer, and it helps us learn from one another. And they empower others. They pay attention to diversity of thinking, and you know, create a physiological safety and focus on team cohesion. So I found this quote from Otto Scharmer, who, when I read this, I was like, oh my gosh, this sums this up so well. And it says, decision makers across institutions of the system have to go on a joint journey from seeing only their own viewpoint to experiencing the system from the perspective of other players, particularly those who are marginalized. The goal must be to co-sense, co-inspire, and co-create an emerging future for their system that values the well-being of all rather than just a few. So when you're looking at your overall strategy, ultimately you want to create equity and not just equality. And people use these terms interchangeably, but they are very, very different. So when you're focusing on your overall strategy, looking at recruitment and retention strategies that consider future employees. You know, we talked about millennials and Gen Zers. They work completely different than those who are more seasoned like me. And, you know, they appreciate being able to come into work later, and don't necessarily mind working until 10 or 11 o'clock to complete whatever the assignment is, if they have the autonomy to go have a coffee with a friend in the afternoon. So keeping those kinds of things in mind, including a commitment to hire and promote people of color. And let me also include making sure that you're utilizing diverse suppliers in your supply chain. You know, are you supporting Black-owned businesses? You know, even if you find 1 or 2 Black-owned businesses that you can support the growth and development of those firms within your within your organ or across your organization, that is huge. That is huge. Create a culture of inclusion that creates a space for all employees to contribute, and ultimately position DE&I as a responsibility of everyone in the organization. So we heard Mona talk about the leaders of some of their ERGs are completely different than what the ERG is meant for. You've got to have diversity of leadership. I like to say diversify the diversity office, because it's so important, and it really creates inclusion across the board and across the organization, and it supports the buy-in of everyone involved. So I would be remiss if I didn't talk about diversifying your supply chain, being a subject matter expert in this area. And I'd like to talk about what is supplier diversity. So supplier diversity is a proactive business strategy that seeks to provide suppliers equity in sourcing and purchasing opportunities. And supplier diversity programs typically focus on and encourage the utilization of diverse-owned suppliers, including women, minority, disability, LGBTQ+, veteran-owned business enterprises. And let me say this, there are literally like 16 different categories that a diverse-owned supplier can be certified in. And unfortunately, we don't have time to go through all of that this evening. But ultimately, supplier diversity is meant to provide equity in sourcing and purchasing opportunities. So let me back up a little bit, because I wanted to talk about some strategies to as you're implementing your supplier diversity initiatives. And the thing is when you are implementing a supplier diversity initiative, you have to be very strategic about how you build that initiative. So I would offer as a first step that you build a strategic plan and that you identify short, mid, and long-term goals for what you want your program to look like. When you have a strategic plan, it literally sets the foundation for the growth and development of your strategy across your organization, across your business units, for institutions of higher education, for your colleges and your departments. And it really sets a foundation for everyone across your organization to follow. You want to, as you develop your supplier base, you want to look at areas of low-hanging fruit when you're developing your suppliers. Who's doing business with you already? How can you increase what you're doing with them? How do you grow what they're doing across your business units? If they may be doing business in one area, how do we move them to expansion and doing business in several different areas across your business? And so those are key things to take a look at. You want to make sure that you're looking at the possibility to try and compete segments of your business to potentially diverse suppliers only. And for you private institutions and organizations out there, you really have the autonomy to set up your program in the way that you want to. Now, let me say this for our government partners that are listening to the session. You really want to make sure that you're conscious of laws that may impact the validity of your program. One case law that I'd like to offer is the City of Richmond versus Croson, which has set a precedence in the build out of supplier diversity initiatives for public institutions, because you want to make sure that you're protecting your programs from a legal standpoint, and they have to stand up to strict scrutiny. And it just depends on, whether you have a race conscious program or a race neutral program. And so there's a lot that kind of goes into that. And then additionally, our government partners have to be aware of other requirements when you are using federal dollars, because there may be disadvantaged business enterprise requirements that are that have to be a part of that contract. And it really does depend on the source of funding that you are using as to how you build out your program. Ultimately, you want to protect your programs, because when you implement these programs, you want to make sure that the program stays intact and that it benefits everyone involved. So I want to talk about the National Minority Supplier Development Council recommended best practices for supplier diversity programs. This is an amazing organization that is nationwide. And no matter where you are in the country, there is a chapter or an affiliate council that can work with you, to help you establish a program. But then not only that, they can help you identify minority suppliers that you can use in your supply chain. So according to the National Minority Supplier Development Council, one of the first things that they suggest is establishing a policy and top management support. Secondly, developing a diverse supplier program, developing a diverse supplier development plan and process, developing a comprehensive internal and external communications plan, which is extremely, extremely important, because internally, if your buyers across your organization don't understand and recognize your organization's mission around supplier diversity, your program will not be successful. And especially when in institutions of higher education, you may have thousands of people who have the ability to purchase or procure goods, services, supplies, or construction services on behalf of your organization. So it's really important and key to the success of a program to make sure that those people that have purchasing authority understand the mission of the organization. And then externally communicating with your suppliers so that they understand how to do business with your organization, how to register as a supplier, and so forth and so on. Identify opportunities for diverse-owned businesses in strategic sourcing and supply chain management. Tracking and reporting and goal-setting mechanisms. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. And establishing a continuous improvement plan and establishing a Tier 2 utilization program. And that is basically, as an organization, you are contracting directly with maybe a major construction firm who may be building a facility for you. And you're saying to that construction firm, we want you to infuse diverse business utilization in a subcontracting capacity to support the growth of what we're doing in our DE&I and supplier diversity initiatives across the organization. So what are some ways that organizations can measure value? Most organizations look at total diversity spend as the bottom line factor of success for a program. But I would like to offer that that is not the only way that you gauge success of your program. These are some other ways that you can take a look at. The number of diverse suppliers engaged, the number of suppliers mentored and developed, internal customer satisfaction, the economic impact on the local community, and some, for corporate organizations, looking at revenue uplift and new market penetration is huge as well. So these are some ways that you as an organization can measure the value of what you're doing in the supplier diversity space. So finally, as you implement all of your DE&I strategies across the board, have thoughtful conversations, more thoughtful conversations about DE&I. It's so important to have this important dialogue. Advocate and establish policies and programs that positively impact your organization's culture. Measure your performance. Again, don't restrict DE&I leadership involvement to women and minorities. If you don't have the expertise in-house, bring in a subject matter expert to assist you with strategy. Show your commitment and not just do or say, do what I do, or do what I say and not what I do. Be intentional. And finally, educate yourself and those in your sphere of influence about the lived experiences of people of color, women, LGBTQ+, and persons with disabilities. Everyone. And I would just like to offer, give yourself some grace. Building a successful DE&I initiative, it's not a marathon. It really is a marathon. It really is not a sprint. And a lot of you may just be starting out and you may just be focusing on these initiatives. So you have to give yourself some grace, give your leaders grace. Just by being a part of this conversation is making progress. So I applaud each and every one of you on this course for what you're doing, because you are being intentional. And so today I want to just thank you for your time. I know that we had a very limited amount of time, but I'm hoping that something that was said will resonate with you, and that you will be successful in building out your diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives across your organizations. And my wish for you is that you prosper and be fulfilled in all that you do. Thank you so much.